morning, everyone. This conference is about Charity 3.0, right? Rethinking the way we engage with the poor and moving away from the dominant approach of kind of emergency and relief that we've been talking about this morning and a little bit I did last night and Tom, to this entrepreneurial understanding of entrepreneurial solutions to poverty. I think this is a very important shift, so I'm really happy to be part of it and be part of this discussion and to learn from all the other speakers. This morning, Soledad's talk was great, and then the pastor's talk was fantastic, and all the examples about how this is really not about us, right? We sometimes want to make poverty alleviation about us. We want to be the hero, and I think this focus in looking at the creative capacity of the person is so important. And this is something that we've been doing at the PovertyCure project and also with the film Poverty, Inc. We showed the trailer of it last night, and I think some of you saw the screening a couple weeks ago here in Kansas City. But what I want to do today is talk about Charity 1.0. So that's a little strange. Aren't we moving forward? I mean, isn't the charity not working? Why are we going back? Why would I be talking about 1.0? Well, here's why. If we're going to make a radical shift to Charity 3.0, and the way we think about it, then we need to be radical. And if we're going to be radical, we need to go to the radix, to the root, right? The Latin word for root is radix, and that's the connection of radical. So some of you use iPhones, right? I have an iPhone 6. I like the iPhone 6. Right? I wasn't sure if I would, but I like it. So maybe I'll get an endorsement from that. From Apple, will support Poverty, Inc. But anyway, I like the iPhone 6. Now, let's imagine that it came out with an iPhone 7. And the iPhone 7 looked different. It worked differently. It was always failing. It was always crashing. The phone didn't work. The apps didn't work. Sometimes they worked, but then it was like here, and this part worked in little things, but the overall effect of the iPhone 7 was driving you crazy. And sometimes it would like burn your hand, okay? You would say, they say, look, we need an iPhone 8. Now, if they were gonna do an iPhone 8, would you want them to build it on the iPhone 7, or would you want them to go back to the iPhone 6 that you liked so much? You wouldn't want them to build it on the broken model. You want to build it on a model that actually worked. And that's why I want to talk about Charity 1.0. Because C.S. Lewis has this line, he says, progress is not going forward if you're going in the wrong direction. So if we're going to improve the way we engage with the poor, if we're going to promote entrepreneurial solutions to poverty and build a Charity 3.0, then we need to build it on the right foundations, not on broken foundations. Now, last night I talked about how we need not just a heart for the poor. We do need a heart for the poor. We are called by God to serve the poor. That's not a question. But we also need a mind for the poor, right? I talked about this intrinsic connection between charity and truth, and that when charity is separated from truth, it degenerates into sentimentality. Right? And I mentioned that we're not called as Christians to random acts of kindness, okay? We're not called to exercise our will on behalf of the poor. I mean, I think that example this morning in Kibera, the man took his shirt off and he gave it, and everybody was crying, and all the sentimentality. I mean, you're just oozing with sentimentality. The only sad thing is they didn't have a video there to capture it, so we could raise a little bit of money for it, right? This sentiment. Now, listen, I'm not attacking the heart of the person who did it, right? I mean, I know my own heart, it's bad enough. I don't need to attack somebody else's, okay? What I'm saying is that there's something wrong, right? And so what we are called not to random acts of kindness, we are called to the virtue of charity, right? Now, charity, if you remember, is one of the three theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. Charity, right? So, and as I talked yesterday, it's connected to the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and bravery. Right? And they're called cardinal virtues because they are the hinge, the hinge on which the moral life runs and is held up. And if we're going to exercise charity, we need to exercise it with prudence. And prudence is not being careful, right? Prudence is seeing the world as it is and acting accordingly. Seeing the world as it is and acting accordingly. So we are called to exercise our charity ordained by reason because we are created in the image of God, the Logos, and oriented to truth. So charity and truth are connected. So what I'd like to do today is focus on some of the underlying theological and philosophical problems with our current understanding of charity, humanitarianism, and the dominant model of economic development. I would argue that the dominant idea of how we engage the poor is not charity, but is humanitarianism. And humanitarianism looks like charity, but it's actually a secular, hollowed out version of Christian love that stays focused on material needs. It has limited horizons. It doesn't look at the spiritual capacity of the person. It stops at providing material comfort and needs. Are we supposed to provide material comfort and needs? Of course. But are we supposed to stop there? And the answer is no. And so modern humanitarianism, modern charity, stops at this limited horizon of the person. It is a sentimental love of mankind, but isn't really that interested in individual men and women and their story, in their situation as subjects. Now, charity, on the other hand, comes from the Latin word caritas, right? Which is related to the Greek agape. And this means this understanding of Christian love. What do I mean by that? Love is the seeking the good of the other. It is to will the other person's good, right? It is the intentio benevolentia, the intention, the desire for the benevolence, for the good of the other person with whom we are in relationship. That's what charity is. Charity is not giving you stuff. It might entail giving you stuff, but charity is the seeking of the good of the other, the desire for that person's benevolence. So the goal of charity then is to promote human flourishing, human development, keeping, of course, always the eternal destiny in mind. That the person is not simply something that's going to pop out at the end of time, at the end of their life, but in fact has a destiny to live well, to die, to live holy, to die well, and to spend eternal life with God. So as C.S. Lewis says, you have never met a mere mortal. Civilizations, cultures, these are mortal, but it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. This is whom we're in relationship with. This is to whom charity is directed. It is directed to a person. And charity is to seek the good of the other. So authentic charity must be rooted in truth, and specifically about the truth about the nature of the human person. Or otherwise, it, as I said, degenerates into sentimentality. And so too often, our Christian charity is a bad copy of a bad copy of Christian love. Let me repeat what I'm saying. Humanitarianism, ladies and gentlemen, that dominant view that shapes the way we think, is a bad copy of Christian love. It's a hollowed out, materialist, boring copy of Christian love. And what too many of us have done is we look at humanitarianism and let's model ourselves after the bad copy. And that's why today I'm talking about Charity 1.0. Because I think we need entrepreneurial solutions. I think there's wonderful things going on with the things that people have been talking about and the work that Finca's doing and the SME investing, and there's all these things going on. But even that's not going to work if we don't understand who we're dealing with and what we are called to do in a partnership relationship. So we need to go back to our traditions and recapture authentic charity. We need to build Charity 3.0 on Charity 1.0. So the first problem then is we have a broken understanding of humanitarianism and charity. That's the first problem. The second problem is related, and that we have turned people into the objects of our charity, to the objects of our pity, and to the objects of our compassion, instead of seeing them as the subjects and protagonists of their own story of development. We have objectified the person. We treat people like things. Now, you combine humanitarianism and the objectification of the person into the current model of the current milieu, which is a social engineering, techno-utopianism, and now the next thing you know, we have massive social engineering projects that we're going to come and solve poverty in the developing world. And people become cogs in the machines of the experts from Harvard and Yale and London School of Economics and the United Nations and the World Bank and on and on and on. And we're going to come solve your problems for you. And so you combine bad understandings of charity, i.e. humanitarianism, objectification of persons, and social engineering, and now we have the poverty industry. But instead, we need to focus on the person. Now, why is the person, maybe it's not right, important? Let me talk about this for a minute. I said we treat people like things. I gave this thing. I said we turn people into the objects of our charity, the objects of our passion, the compassion, the objects of our pity. Okay, what do I mean? Let me give you an analogy, okay? And since we're at a church, I'll give you an analogy from the Bible, all right? That'll maybe help us understand what I mean. In the beginning, when God created the world, he created Adam. And then he placed before Adam all of the animals. And Adam named the animals. And after that, though, Adam was not satisfied. There's something wrong. And God said, it is not good for man to be alone. Let us make him a helpmate. So God put Adam into a deep sleep, and out of Adam's rib, he created Eve. And he put Eve in front of him. And what did Adam say? He said, at last, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, at last. Angelo Scola describes it like this. What Adam saw was identity, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, and difference. Identity and difference. And in that identity and difference was a call to communion. And that communion is sublime in itself. But from that communion comes another subject willed for his or her own sake. Another subject willed by God for his or her own sake. You hear sometimes saying, children are a gift. And they are a gift. And I don't mean that sentimentally. I mean that ontologically. Children are not a choice. Children are a gift that we are given to steward because they do not belong to us. And they don't belong to the village. They belong to God himself. Willed by God for their own sake, in community, in relationship. Children are ontologically a gift. Now, what happens? You have in this relationship identity and difference. And Adam and Eve are in an intersubjective relationship. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, two subjects in relationship with one another. And then what happens? The fall happens, right? And what do they cover? They cover their difference. And then God says, you shall desire your husband and he will lord it over you. And what happens is the gaze of Adam stops at the difference. The difference comes in front of the identity. And Adam turns Eve into an object for his own gratification, for his own use, and vice versa. And so we have an objectification. Now, of course, one of the things in tradition in Christian marriage is understood as a remedy for concupiscence, okay? What in the world is that, all right? Concupiscence, remember, are the effects of original sin. And St. Paul says, I do what I hate and I don't do what I want. Okay, you know that feeling? You're like, I'm going to be really nice. I am not going to say a bad word. Do you know what that person did? Right? Oh, I blew it, right? You have this something pressing against the center of your freedom. And our freedom is overtaken by our passions, right? I do what I hate, I don't do what I want. That's the effects of concupiscence. Now, in the marital life, in the sexual life, marriage is a remedy for concupiscence. And pardon my vulgarity, but I do not mean that marriage is an outlet for horniness. That's not what it means. It means that it is a cure for the effects of original sin, which means what? That in an intersubjective relationship between the man and a woman, in self-gifting, in self-donation, the man and the woman give themselves to one another, and the difference comes here into its proper place. And they see each other in an intersubjective relationship. And they become naked without shame. The original unity of man and woman. Now, this objectification that you all understand, there's no one in the room who's like, I don't get that. You all get that. We have all experienced it. Now, analogously, though with less gravity, this is what we do to poor people. This is what we do to other people. The identity is covered by the difference, and we turn poor people into objects. Sometimes into objects of our own heroism, and sometimes simply into objects of our own sentimentality. We want to feel good about ourselves. And so we use poor people to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. But poor people are not objects. They are subjects, just like we are. Right? We are subjects, and and poor people are, as I said, the protagonists in their own story of development. Poor countries are not places for experiments by social engineers or nominalist do-gooders. Okay? For the philosophers, you're like the nominalist do-gooder. Nominalism is just like a raw exercise. Liberty is merely the exercise of your will. I'm just going to go do some good to save the world. No. Poor people are not a place for experiments so that we can feel good about ourselves. Poor people are subjects. And so the main question is not how can we solve poverty and what are we going to do to improve our charity? The main question is what are the foundations that enable people to create prosperity for their own families and for their own communities? And then how can we come alongside and help? And that's why I talked about the institutions of justice last night. That's why I talked about private property, clear title to land, access to justice in the courts, ability to engage in economic activity, and being connected to networks of productivity and exchange. If we're going to move to Charity 3.0, we need to get Charity 1.0 correct, and we need to rebuild our foundations. And at the core of charity, as I said, is the dignity of the human person, willed for his own sake by God. Charity, and I want to be clear, is sometimes there's a problem, there's an emergency, and we're not supposed to say, hey, let me help you build your business. We're supposed to help them in that emergency. But as I said, that's become the model of development. And a richer form of charity is to partner with people. The Jewish medieval philosopher Moses Maimonides has 7 levels of charity. Some of you may be familiar with them. And in the highest form of charity, he says the greatest level above which there is no greater, right, is to endow someone, he says, to support a fellow Jew by endowing him with a gift or a loan, or entering into partnership with him, or finding employment for him in order to strengthen his hand until he need no longer be dependent upon others. And this is where business people have so much to offer. This is where entrepreneurs have so much to offer, not only in money and funding things, but in their expertise, in their time, in their skills as business people. We often hear, if North American Christians were more generous, we could raise $84 billion and eradicate extreme poverty forever. No, we couldn't. Because poor people are not poor because they lack stuff. And we cannot buy our way out of poverty. Poor people are poor because they are excluded, because they lack the institutions of justice, and because they are excluded from networks of productivity. So at the center of Charity 3.0, I would argue, must be a partnering with the poor, engaging with them as partners and subjects, and introducing them and including them into our networks of productivity. There will always be need for help, and there will always be need for immediate meeting of an emergency, and human love will always be required. We cannot solve the world's problems with markets or business or loans or partnerships. Man is not redeemed by markets. Man is redeemed by love and by the love of God. If we're going to radically shift to 3.0, we need to go back to the roots. And the roots, that dignity of the human person. Because when we understand the dignity of the human person, endowed with creative capacity and made in the image of God, it changes absolutely everything about the way we understand charity, missions, development, and the poor. Thank you for your time.